And it is so beautiful, our recording machinery. Awesome. Nice to see you all this afternoon. How are you guys doing? All okay? Good. So, basically, the subtitle for this lecture is going to be, and now for something completely different, right? So the last 4 lectures, basically, we've been really focusing on stuff about how one particular, even just part of speech is supposed to work. How does it have meaning? How do singular terms function? And the thought, hey, come on in. And the thought today is to really pivot hard. And to pivot hard both in terms of moving away from thinking about particular parts of speech to looking at whole sentences, but even to move away from pure semantics, so just worrying about meaning or how reference functions, to think about another aspect of language use altogether. So what we're going to do is basically 3 parts. 2 of them are, let's just suss out what exactly is going on with Austin and his idea of speech acts, so some utterances as a kind of action. So the thought here is really just first to talk about what the hell Austin's even on about, what are speech acts supposed to be, how did he think about them, how are they intended to function, and then we'll talk about felicity conditions. So these are distinct from truth conditions, but they do something kind of similar with regards to performatives, performing certain actions with words. And this is going to be set up for us to turn to an applied instance of speech act theory, which is Langton talking about pornography as a particular kind of speech act. So that's the plan. With regards to structuring today's meeting, do people have deep, dark preferences? Break or end early? End early is fine. That's perfectly good for me. So yeah, why don't we aim for that, and then I suspect we'll be able to push through and everything, but I want to leave time to talk about both the Austin stuff and Langton's argument. So I should say 2 things. First, again, what we're really going to do, speaking of performative, what I really want to do 2 things. So what's important, well, not important, what I really want to do for this lecture is to make sure that we're all kind of on the same page with regards to how speech acts are supposed to work. That's going to be the first bit. And then the second part is, let's just think about Langton's argument. I'm not really concerned too much with whether we think it succeeds or fails, but I want to just talk about how she uses the Austin stuff to kind of make a particular point. That's the real thing I want to get through. We can talk a little bit about whether we think Langton succeeds or not. Maybe a useful thing. Do people read the Langton? Are people familiar with the Langton? It's okay, you can be honest. I'll take that as a no. So Langton's claim, which is actually a pretty famous one in feminist philosophy, is that pornography is a silencing speech act. So what Langton's after, just to spoil some things we'll talk about in a bit, is she's trying to not necessarily vindicate, but put some meat on a particular claim that feminists, or some feminists made, that pornography should be banned. And it shouldn't be banned because it's indecent or uncivil, but it should be banned because it's actually a form of silencing. It prevents certain kinds of speech acts. That's Langton's argument. And of course, for that to work, we have to make sense of the speech act theory and then think about how particular speech acts could actually prevent or undercut other speech acts. So that's the kind of setup. We'll talk about speech act theory, and then Langton is a lovely applied case. So let's get into sweet, sweet Austin. I love this picture because it looks so much to me like he's got a bubble pipe. Like, it just doesn't look real. Okay, so here's the beginning. The very first thing to note is a distinction, which we've kind of touched on once, but a distinction between what we might think of as utterances versus sentences. So we can get this distinction by just thinking about this. So this string of English letters, by itself, what does this string of English letters mean? Like, does this string of letters have any meaning? By itself? I mean, there's kind of a weirdness, right? Because by itself, who's the my? That's the trick, right? Another way to think about it is your, right? If we just had your favorite beer. If it's just written by itself, it's not really clear who it's addressing. There's kind of a gap. Right? And the gap's filled in by knowing who's making or who's expressing the sentence. Right? In this case, you can guess it's, I wrote it. Right?
Which one?
Oh, the 12. The 12, right. Because the other ones are like, there's the prior, and I forget the other. Yeah, but they also have similar kind of names. So, yeah. Right. So, importantly, what's the difference here? What am I trying to get at with this silly example? So the difference is if you just think about the English sentence by itself, this construction, does it have meaning versus when someone uses it, when someone uses the English sentence to say something? So to put some terminology here, we can talk about the sentence itself versus the utterance, the actual thing that I might try and do if I use this sentence to say, my favorite beer is St. Bernardus Habit, which is true. So note, we've already come across this. This was something that Strawson really leaned into when he was talking about Russell. He accused Russell of basically making a mistake in equating thinking about the meaning of the present King of France in and of itself versus particular people's uses of the present King of France. This was the line that Strawson was really worried about. But importantly, when we think about these differences, what we're really after is there just some intrinsic meaning in the literal linguistic expression, or do people mean things when they use these linguistic expressions? That's our first little point of background. The second point of background has to do with sentence types. And this is actually something just kind of at the level of grammar, but we can also think about how people use language to do different things. And we can contrast declarative sentences with other sentence types. So declarative sentences declare things about the world. They say things are or are not the case. In contrast, interrogative sentences ask questions. Imperative sentences make commands. And exclamatory sentences, well, they don't really say anything so much as just maybe express some kind of emotion or highlight something. So I might ask, what's your favorite beer? I might command, I bought this, you will drink it. Or I might just say, wow, this beer is terrible. Note that that was two different sentences. One of them was explanatory, the other was making a declarative. I'm saying that this beer is bad. So what's notable is declarative sentences seem to say something about the world. And more importantly, they seem to be what we'll call truth-apt. That is, they look up for truth values. Exactly what values they have, maybe that's something we need to go and work out. But it seems weird to say that a question has a truth value. It doesn't even make sense. It's almost a category mistake to ask, what's the truth value of what's your favorite beer? Is it true or false? Yeah, it doesn't compute. And the same thing with wow. What's the truth value of wow? That's a bad question. So we can do some grammar to help us pull things apart and think about just declarative sentences. Of course, here's something neat. In theory, we can use other forms of sentences to actually express things that are truth-apt. Here's an easy example. If someone asks me something, do you think Miguel will pass the test? And I just say, wow. I'm implying the no. I'm implying, without actually saying, that I don't think he'll pass. You see the idea? So, Austin's big focus, when he's thinking about these things, is a little bit close to what we were just doing. He says, in the opening to How to Do Things with Words, said, I want to discuss a kind of utterance that looks like a statement and grammatically will be classed as a statement, which is not nonsensical, but it isn't really true or false. Furthermore, if a person makes an utterance of this sort, we should say that he's doing something rather than merely saying something. This is the key bit. They're doing something rather than merely saying something. So it's easy if we think about some examples. So I might say, look, I apologize for what I did. Or I have a bottle of champagne and I hit the front of a ship and I say, I named the ship the Queen Elizabeth. Or, they put me in charge of a party or a festival, and I open it by saying, I declare that the festival is open. Everybody can go get a beer now. Here's my recommendation. So note, what are we doing when we say things like this? With these utterances, we're not merely saying something. I'm not just expressing something that's possibly true fact. We're doing stuff. We're naming a ship. We're opening a festival. We're apologizing. Another one. I promise that if I'm healthy, then I'll be here for the class. Right? I'm making you a promise. I'm also making an assertion that could be true or false, depending on what happens with my promise. So see, what we're doing in all of these cases is actually doing stuff with the utterance, not just saying stuff. So far, so good? So Austin says, in all these cases, he's got a bunch, he says it'd be absurd to regard the thing that I say as a report of the performance of the action, which is undoubtedly done. We should rather say that in saying what I do, I actually perform the action. In other words, to go back, let's look at the apology. This isn't me reporting on my apology. This is actually me giving my apology. In the utterance, the very act of apologizing is occurring. Similarly, the declaration is the utterance. The very utterance is the thing that's performing the action of declaring. That is, the above all involve performances of the action that is mentioned. And Austin says that in these cases, what's happening isn't actually something that's true or false. Instead, there's just some performance, some action being undertaken. So he draws a distinction between what he calls performative utterances and, a lovely word, constative utterances. Performative utterances aren't truth act, they do stuff. Constative utterances are truth act, they just merely make declarations. So this was Austin's original idea. He thought there was a very clear and distinct difference between performative and constative. Unfortunately, there isn't. But it's worth just kind of getting an idea. Purely performative ones would just be doing something. Purely constative would just be merely expressing something that's true or false. It's very unlikely we're ever going to have pure ones of either end. Yeah, I mean, a constative one might be just something like, the table is gray. Where what we're doing is trying to express some fact rather than actually performing some action. Here's the trick, though, and this is why this distinction arguably collapses. The table is gray, and I declare that the table is gray. seem to be the same sentence. I mean, they're different linguistic elements, but they say the same thing. And if we think they say the same thing, then we have a problem. Because plausibly, when I say, I declare the table is gray, I'm doing one of these things. I'm just making it explicit that the action I'm performing is expressing a declarative sentence. Another way we would do it is, instead of saying, I apologize for what I did, we just say, I'm sorry. We make this bit implicit in what's said. All of these make the performance explicit, but we can get the same without doing it explicitly. This is one of the problems with this hard and fast distinction. They get very blurred very quickly. So, to kind of lean into this a bit, very quickly into his stuff, Austin realized that, hey, grammatical form alone isn't going to cut the mustard here. It's not going to tell the difference between when an utterance is performative or constative. This was also in Morris's introduction chapter. He talks about a case where a judge is writing in their diary, right? And they're just writing what they did that day. So, for example, the judge's diary says, oh, spoke with Richards at this point. I promised I'll be there at 10 tomorrow. I promise I'll be there. If he's just keeping a note of what he did at each hour, say. The very same sentence in that case isn't making a promise. It's merely describing what happened. He promised. But in the moment that he actually said it, of course, the very same linguistic construction would be uttered as a performative. Another one is just yes. On its own, this isn't really clearly a performative or a constative. But we can make it be a performative. Suppose if someone says, do you take this person to be your partner in sickness and in health? Yes. Right. In so doing, you are performing something. You're agreeing to effectively a social contract. Or you might just ask, is the table gray? Yes. You're effectively just repeating the constative claim. So, there's a clear difference in some sense between performatives and constative claims, or utterances. One is clearly just meant to be expressing some truth apt proposition, the other is doing something, but it's very hard to fully pull them apart. It isn't going to happen grammatically, even if we think about the explicit ones. And it's also not really clear it's going to happen when we actually think of people's genuine utterances. This especially gets worse when we know that performatives can be explicit or implicit. Very helpfully, Austin calls the opposite primary. So explicit or primary, which is not very useful. But we can also read primary as an implicit. So the idea here is that we might just say, I'll be there. And in saying, I'll be there, what you're actually doing is making a promise. Will you be at the party later? I'll be there. Contrast that with the explicit version of the performative where you say, I promise that I'll be there. In this case, what you're doing is making it grammatically explicit that you're performing this action. But these are basically the same. And this is very similar to the case we mentioned a second ago. We talk about the table is gray. I declare that the table is gray. One of them just makes the sort of act I'm performing a bit more explicit. And this highlights the fact that constative utterances probably are performative too. The cat's on the mat. I state that the cat's on the mat. This is the kind of thing that Oxford philosophers of language often say. It's not very helpful, but it seems to be saying the same thing as the cat is on the mat. Okay. So, all of this is a big setup for something that's deep and dark, according to Austin. And the idea is that in ordinary uses of language, in ordinary utterances, a speaker performs at least 2 and possibly 3 different acts in the process of uttering. So I'll give you a famous example from Austin. It's also one that Langton talks about. It's slightly unhappy, and then we'll talk about a slightly more happy one. So here's the initial example from Austin. We have 2 men standing near a woman. The first man turns to the second and says, "Shoot her." The second looks shocked and then proceeds to shoot the woman. Slightly grim. One of the early examples of philosophers being drawn towards violent examples. But let's just think about what happens with this utterance, the first person's utterance. According to Austin, there's 3 act types that occur here. There's a locutionary act. A locutionary act is basically just speaking words with the meanings they usually have. It's saying something. So in this example, it's meaning shoot with the word shoot, and meaning this person with the word her. So this is the kind of thing that we might be interested in if you're just focused on semantics. Just focused on sentence meaning, or something like that. That's a locutionary act. Just expressing some semantic amount. There's also what we'll call a perlocutionary act. This is the effects or the consequences of what's said. What we achieve by the utterance. So in this case, by saying shoot her, the first person, the first man, shocked and persuaded the second into performing an action. So there's results here. These are the perlocutionary acts. The intended outcomes, the intended effects. Maybe not even necessarily intended. We'll come to that in a moment. But here's the really important one. And this is the neat third thing, right? So locutionary is what's said, expressing something. Perlocutionary is the stuff that's supposed to happen in the world as a consequence. The inlocutionary act, that's actually the actions constituted by the utterance. What is done in the saying. So in this case, you might think, for this weird example, the first person is urging or convincing or even commanding the second to shoot.
What's the difference with
Good. So importantly, these are kind of in terms of what happens later. This is what's happening with the very speech act. So I'll give you a better example. I think this section doesn't, it kind of blurs. Let me use my second example. This is my favorite one. So in my second example, we have a football referee. And the football referee, in seeing a ball being played and where a certain person is on the pitch, says offside. Blows his whistle, says offside. So what do we have here? Again, locutionary, perlocutionary, and illocutionary acts. The locutionary one is effectively the referee declaring that the offensive player is in an inappropriate position relative to others. The perlocutionary result is the referee's forcing play to stop, he's awarding the ball to the other team, he's giving control, or he's taking the ball away from the team that has it and giving it to another one. Like, this is the effects. The illocutionary act is him making a ruling. And in saying offsides, that is the ruling. And then the consequences of the ruling mean this team loses possession of the ball, etc., 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 etc. That's the key difference. The perlocutionary act is effectively like bringing about certain consequences. The illocutionary act is what is actually done in the very act of uttering. So it's sometimes hard to tease them apart. Again, I think in this case it's a bit, but I hope it's a slightly more clear here. So importantly, Austin thinks that, again, arguably every utterance is going to have all three of these aspects. If it doesn't have this, then it's certainly going to have those two. Because even very flat-footed declarative sentences, declarative utterances, have locutionary acts involved. They express something. And they have consequences, even if it's just minimal ones like getting you to believe what I've declared, or you affirming or denying the declarative sentence. Before we go on, again, it's worth pausing and asking, is the difference between the three different acts clear? I'll probably ask you about it on the exam. But again, I think it's genuinely cool to note Austin's tracking this, right? When we think about utterances, that there's all of these possible going on, and that they're different. There's what's said, there's what results from what's said, and then there's actually the action that's constitutive of the saying. To go back a few, looking at these ones, right? We'll have, right, what's being said. This is the locutionary act, the kind of semantic content here. The perlocutionary act, hoping that you'll forgive me, right? Persuading you to forgive me, etc. Then there's the actual illocutionary act of me apologizing. Same thing with this, right? The illocutionary act here is baptizing, naming. And the perlocutionary is everyone hopefully is now going to use this name to refer to this ship. And for the last one, the perlocutionary act is, well, people enjoying the festival or doing festival-type things. The illocutionary act is me declaring that the festival is open. The very utterance is the declaration. So again, we have these three different parts, all of which are being done, three different actions, all of which are being done in the very act of performing one utterance. The referee says offside, and it does all three of these at the same time. Very cool. Okay. So, why is this interesting? Well, Austin basically thought that we need desperately to think more about illocutionary acts. That is, again, the actions done by making utterances. He thought that philosophy of language was far too concerned with things like semantic meaning, with thinking about what we might say, or the locutionary acts involved. Similarly, some people, Davidson, who we haven't talked about, were too concerned with what we might think of as the perlocutionary acts, the behavior that speech leads to. We want to be concerned with this special weird third thing that no one seemed to clock. And one reason we can see why this is important is just demarcating different kinds of actions that are done with individual utterances. If I say, I'll be there, so this is an example I even used earlier. If I say, I'll be there, I can be doing two different things, and maybe even doing two different things all at the same time. One of them is making a future prediction. I'm going to be at the party. That can be true or false. Notably, it might suggest some expectations, but it doesn't draw them out. It doesn't entail them. But if I'm making a promise, then it looks like I am setting expectations. You should be mad at me if I don't show up. I made a promise. And the big connection here is that when we look at a given utterance, we want to know, is this making a statement? Is it asking a question? Is it making a commitment? And the grammar alone isn't going to settle this. We have to know what kind of act is involved in the active utterance. That's the big thing to take away from Austin. We want to know the sort of illocutionary act being performed because that can have impact on how to take the utterance, how to read it, if you like. Okay. So, that's genuinely Austin in a nutshell, which is great. The other important thing here is about when performatives succeed or fail. Or to put it another way, when do illocutionary acts succeed or fail? And note, this is different than when does an utterance true or false. Because we're not really necessarily concerned with the semantic content. We're concerned with whether the action kind of, to put it in a weird phrase, goes off or not. Does the action occur? And we can think of a few examples. So, if I say, I declare you married, well, the illocutionary act of that declaration can fail if, say, I don't have a marriage license, or we're not in a particular location where that can happen. Or, to go really heavy, if there are certain kinds of laws that prevent certain kinds of marriages from happening. And this doesn't really seem, again, like there's truth or falsity here. It's not really about the truth or falsity of me declaring, because that's happening, right? I'm doing that. It's whether this declaration succeeds in its act. Another one is, I appoint you consul. Cool. That doesn't work if the person you're appointing has already become consul. If someone else has come along and beaten you to it. Or maybe if they're just not eligible. Say they're not even running. You don't have the vested authority. My favorite example, though, again, what I'm very familiar with, is if you're a drunk fan in the stands and you yell offside. Right? That doesn't work. Play doesn't stop. The ball doesn't switch hands or feet. Because you don't have the authority to make this kind of declaration. You can't perform that sort of act. Because you're not the right sort of person. As I know all too well. So, what do these basically suggest? Well, look, performative utterances, these illocutionary acts, can fail to come off in lots of different ways. And conditions have to be met for these performatives to be formed felicitously. This is a wonderful word. It just means, effectively, happily or successfully. So conditions have to be met for the illocutionary act to achieve what it's aimed at, what it's trying to do. So what do felicity conditions look like? Now note, felicity conditions aren't, again, the same as truth conditions. They're when an illocutionary act, a speech act, goes off or not. And here's one thing. It looks like a certain convention must exist, and it needs to be accepted amongst the people that the act is occurring to, or with. We need a convention that will be invoked. An easy one, go back. Declarations of marriage don't work if you don't have a concept or a social institution of marriage. If there's no convention about people with license being able to go around stipulating certain social contracts, well then, this don't mean nothing. The act just doesn't happen. Similarly, circumstances need to be appropriate. You have to have the right person in the right place, invested with the right authority. And importantly, the ceremony needs to be completely and correctly executed. So, take my drunk in the stands, saying offside. Right? They don't have the right authority. Or another one is if the whole kind of marriage celebration or ceremony gets interrupted, well, then we might say that the marriage didn't successfully go through. The festival wasn't declared open because, well, they never quite finished their speech. Maybe they were too drunk and fell off the stage. Sounds like a theme here. Another one is the act needs to be ratified. That is, as Austin says, there has to be what we'll call securing uptake. You might be the right person in the right place with the right authority, but if no one else clocks your act, then your act didn't succeed. There needs to be uptake on it. And the last one that we'll talk a little bit about in the next few weeks, is about intentionality. Whether you need to intend to perform a certain action, or that those who you're doing it to also intend for your action to succeed. So the utterer should have intended to perform the relevant speech act. Another variant example is, imagine that you're in, I don't know, let's say Brazil, and someone's just making some noise through a trumpet, and as it happens, it sounds a hell of a lot like offside. Well, that's clearly not going to perform the elocutionary act, because there's just no intention behind this utterance. You might think that something like this intention is lurking behind even the need for it to be an utterance in the first place. So importantly, what we have, when we think about these things, when we think about felicity conditions, is we have various, if you like, necessary conditions that need to be in place in order for someone to even remotely come close to performing the relevant speech acts. If they ain't there, act can't happen. Okay. Before we trundle on, again, pause and ask questions on this stuff so far. And maybe coming back to something I think we mentioned a couple times. Have you run across these ideas before at all? No? Because I mean, this is a lovely idea that lurks behind certain approaches to philosophy of law. You might think that what's going on a lot of times when we're setting up political systems is we're basically performing something like elocutionary acts. That is, I'm not just proposing things should be structured that way, I'm actually making things become structured that way in the very act of uttering. I invest you with this power. Cool. That is literally giving you some political power. I nominate you. In that very act, what we're doing is putting it forward. So, what this means is that if felicity conditions are not met, elocutionary acts fail. As Langton puts it, an utterance has elocutionary force of a certain kind when it satisfies certain felicity conditions. These are typically set by conventions, written or unwritten, typically required that the speaker is intending to do something with his words. Here's something really weird. An upshot of this is it looks like speech acts, certain elocutionary acts, can make other ones impossible to perform. That is, we might have what we'll call subordinating speech acts, and here are two. So what do these do? What these do is they prevent people from performing certain things. In this case, accessing a beach, or accessing, I think in this area, it's a bus station. Now these aren't necessarily speech acts, but they're not terribly far off from speech acts. And you could certainly see versions of this where it might have to do with disenfranchising people. If you remove people's ability to vote, then if they say, I vote for blah-de-blah, their illocutionary act of voting doesn't go off. Doesn't matter how hard they try or what they intend. You set it so that the felicity conditions guarantee that this person cannot be the right person. You've invoked their ability to be able to perform this illocutionary act. And again, it makes sense. If what's lurking here is something like a set of conventions, the conventions will be set by us basically making a series of performative speech acts. I think we should have these conventions. Yeah, I agree. What are we doing? Well, I did an illocutionary act of advancing. You did an illocutionary act of agreeing. And in so doing, we've set up some conventions that are going to go certain ways and maybe disenfranchise others. We got to suss it out. This idea is what Langton's going to lean heavily into. But again, the things that we're really going to take forward, the first thing to do, coming just from the Austin, the basic speech act idea, go back, is this threefold distinction. When we make an utterance, there's three kinds of acts involved. A locutionary act, a perlocutionary act, and an illocutionary act. Arguably, when we make any kind of utterance, at least the first two happen, often the third as well. That's the big key idea. So far so good. Let's talk about Langton. I would suggest, if you haven't read the paper, which I guess nobody did, but that's okay. I really would suggest reading it. It's really good. It does a great job of summarizing the speech act theory. It also is just an interesting and very famous article in feminist philosophy. So here's the background to Langton's article. There was an anti-pornography civil rights ordinance written by Catherine McKinnon and Andrea Dworkin. It was originally drafted in Minneapolis in 1983, ratified by, I think, the city council in 1983, then also voted in by citizens in Indianapolis, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and in Bellingham, Washington. In every case, the idea was there was a kind of civil case against pornography. And it's not driven by censorship. It's not that this is indecent or obscene. It's instead that pornography violates individuals' civil rights. Allow those harmed by pornography to sue for damages and to add future bans to pornographic material. And who is it that's being harmed? Well, women. The idea, the very opening of the Civil Rights Ordinance says, is we define pornography as the graphic, sexually explicit subordination of women through pictures and words. Now, unfortunately, as it happens, in every one of these cases, it was overturned. The bottom two, in fact, come all the way to the Supreme Court, where this ruling was overturned, in the U.S. Supreme Court, I should say. Sorry. So the key thing here, though, is this opening statement. Because this is massive, right? This doesn't say that pornography expresses subordination or it leads to subordination. It says it is. And quite a few legal scholars and judges responded to this by saying this is just an absolute sleight of hand, or this is philosophically indefensible. It doesn't even make sense to say that pornography is subordinating. You might talk about it having these effects, but you can't say that it just is subordination of women. So that's where Langton comes in. Langton's aim is to make sense of that opening sentence. We're going to make sense of the claim that pornography is subordination, and we're going to use speech act theory to do it. In fact, Langton wants to defend two claims in her article. The first is that pornography subordinates women, and the second is that pornography silences women. Now, a thing to note before we dive into her argument for these two claims is that they're generics. So this isn't that every single possibly pornographic work subordinates women, or every single pornographic work silences women. It's a generic claim. It's a bit like mosquitoes carry malaria. But of course, again, it is trying to make sense of, to go back a slide, this claim, which is quite strong. So the two lines, the idea that pornography subordinates women, is going to be driven by a kind of contrast of the liberty of men to produce or consume pornography, and equality, that is, women's equal civil status. Or more importantly, women's ability to perform certain kinds of speech acts. And for the silencing women, we're going to again have this kind of contrast of liberty of men to produce or consume porn, but this time it's going to be the liberty of women to speak, to just even express in certain kinds of ways. So let's go through them one by one. So here's the first bit, again, kind of defending this idea that pornography subordinates women. Pornography is often recognized as depicting or causing locutionary and perlocutionary subordination. Or to put that slightly less opaque terms, either depicting some fairly demeaning things and possibly causing some fairly demeaning things, some subordination. But that's not what Langton's after. She's after the illocutionary aspect. That is, what the very speech acts involved in porn constitute, the actions involved in the very depiction. Should also note too, when we say speech act here, it doesn't have to literally be speech. Depictions will count as a form of speech. Anything we have that does any kind of expressing is going to allow for this kind of speech act. So, according to McKinnon, and according to Langton, the idea is that porn is subordination because it renders some speech acts unspeakable. And it does so broadly through this idea that sometimes we'll have what we'll call authoritative illocutions. The felicity conditions require the speaker to occupy positions of power in a relevant domain, and when they perform their illocutive acts, they're either going to be veridicative, that is, they're basically delivering something as their authority, or exitive. In this case, they're conferring or depriving rights and powers. A slightly less loaded example is go back to my football referee. My football referee can declare someone offsides. That's something they can do because they have the power. They have control over what happens on the pitch. They can also kick somebody out. They can give them a red card. And deprive that person of the power to be able to continue to play in the game. So those are actual affects. We could also do it with speech. In fact, this happens a lot. Especially in things like what we're doing right now. Right? It's mostly me talking. But we have a kind of thing where most of the time in classes where we have to put our hands up, and we wait for someone to point or call on us or whatever. And that's when you guys get to talk. It's not always like that, but you see the idea. That's basically conferring on you the right to speak. Again, this isn't a terribly wild and crazy idea. But let's apply it to pornography, says Langton. So, does porn subordinate women? Well, Langton says, seems like it. It has 2 out of 3 features. That is, again, it has the locutionary and perlocutionary aspects. It also has aspects of eradicative speech, because it ranks women as sex objects. And it's exudative speech because it legitimizes sexual violence, at least in the case that it encourages people to, say, ignore when people say no, to take that as part of the activity, rather than an actual act of saying no. But we might think about the third feature. Does it actually have this illocutive act involved? And Langton says, yeah, it looks like it does. So she gives three broad arguments here. She gives a kind of inference to the best explanation that the reason it has the various effects that it does is because it involves a certain kind of illocutionary force. She also suggests, her second argument, that the uptake looks like it's this sort of subordinating illocutionary act. But the last one is the one that really uses the speech act theory. And she says, if you think about the felicity conditions, they seem to be met. Felicity conditions for it being a subordinating illocutionary act. So here's how we come at this idea. We ask, do pornography speakers have authority in the relevant domain? And this is going to be influenced by your view of pornographers as either underdogs or as effectively voices of what we might think of as the ruling powers. Note here, obviously, when we say ruling power, we don't mean literal, like, political authority, per se. We mean something like patriarchal power. And this is an empirical question. But Langton suggests pornographers have all the authority of a monopoly, in the sense that they got more money. So the argument here is, yeah, it seems to subordinate women. It seems to be an illocutionary act of subordination. Because that's the best explanation for its effects. Because that's how people seem to take it. And because when we think of the felicity conditions for such an illocutionary act, they seem to be met. So far, so bad. Yeah? Yeah. So I think what you can see that as is pushing against this idea. Yeah, I think so. I think there's a funny terminology here. I think what you might have to say is that isn't technically pornography. Yeah. Right? That's going to be pornography or something like that, right? Because we're trying to, or she's trying to give the characterization that McKinnon had, that quote we had way back at the beginning. This one, where we're defining pornography. So in these cases, what you might have is either weakening of felicity conditions, plausible, or a new kind of speech act that's very grammatically similar, but has different things behind it. I think probably the second one's a little bit better, but yeah, that's perfectly compatible here. This is why I was also saying it's a generic claim, rather than like, oh. Yeah. Okay. Cool. So before we go on, do we get the structure of the argument? Again, how she's using the speech act stuff that we did a few minutes ago to kind of get her to this claim. Whether we agree with it or not, I just want to make sure we get the structure of the argument. That's the important thing. All right. So how about the second one? How do we get the idea that porn silences women? In many ways, I think this is actually the more interesting part of Langton's paper. So the first thing to note is speech acts can be silenced. And they can be silenced in at least three ways. You can prevent any one of the relevant kinds of acts. So you can prevent the locutionary act by literally just preventing any conveyance of semantic content. If you literally just make people unable to produce utterances, they can't say anything. So cool. They don't say anything. That's not really the interesting one, but it's there. You might also have the relevant perlocutionary silencing. That is, you let people say things, but through various actions, you avoid or block or prevent the intended effects. You frustrate the desired outcomes. Again, fair, but not really the money one. This is the interesting one. It seems that what you can do is you can prevent people from being able to perform the acts that they would normally do with the very utterances that they're doing. Now she goes through a bunch of examples, and I thought we'd maybe talk about some of them. So, she gets the first one from Austen, and I'll read it to you, or I'll read you a version of it. So we've got an actor, and they're acting out a scene where there's meant to be a fire. And in her role as to be as pervasive as possible, she screams things like fire, and oh my God, I mean it, look at the smoke, and Jesus, people, what are you doing? Get out, right? However, something about the very conventions of the theater constrains the speech act she can make. She's not actually able to genuinely make the performative illocutionary act of warning people about the fire. The role of being an actor constrains the sort of things that the actor can do, and the actor cannot convey a genuine warning. At least not without breaking into a new context. Here's another one. During apartheid, a black South African performs all the relevant actions required to vote. They make some marks on a piece of paper in a polling booth, marking out a certain way. However, even having performed the relevant actions, the act misfires. They don't get to vote. And they don't get to vote because of anything they did, but it's because they didn't satisfy the felicity conditions. The felicity conditions that were set up by, well, an apartheid government. The act misfires because by South African law, they're not allowed to vote. They cannot perform this speech act, even though they did everything that you're supposed to do to be able to do it. Another example, this is a slightly heavier-handed one. Langton says, in countries where certain Islamic laws hold, women are unable to perform the act of divorce by saying a certain expression which translated means, I divorce you, or I want a divorce. However, men can. So there's one class of people who are allowed to use this expression to actually institute the act of divorce, another is not, simply because of gender. Again, what's going on here is felicity conditions are making it such that you cannot, or some people cannot, perform the relevant actions. And maybe a slightly heavier one, the bigger one, more relevant for this, is a woman says no with the aim of refusing sexual intercourse. She performs the appropriate locutionary act, means what she says, she has the right intentions, but her speech act misfires. And her speech act misfires because it doesn't count as an act of refusal. It's just not uptake. The structure is such that the felicity conditions prevent her from performing that action. She can say something that sounds like it, she can say something that should be taken that way, but refusal has become unspeakable. Again, do we see the idea? I think the idea is really powerful. And we have, as she puts it, a kind of perlocutionary frustration, where the speaker says words, but fails to achieve the intended effect, and the real worrisome one of illocutionary disablement. Which, that is, where the felicity conditions are set in such a way that people can't perform certain kinds of actions, even if they go through everything that otherwise would. So it's pretty clear speech can be silenced by other speech, and speech can make other speech unspeakable. The felicity conditions can be fixed by conventions, which are going to be brought into existence by various speech acts, and they can be revoked by such speech acts as well. So, in performing various illocutionary actions, we can constrain how people can perform later ones. Or, I mean, in a slightly better society, what we would do isn't constrain them, but give them more power. Allow them to be able to perform certain actions. Arguably, this is the kind of thing we do when we confer citizenship on people. Conferring of citizenship is a speech act. And when you say you're now a citizen of the Netherlands, in so doing, you give people various rights. That is, you set the felicity conditions for the sorts of speech acts they can perform, to where they can actually now perform them. They can vote. So, Langton's particular case is a very heavy one. And I think there's an interesting argument. I think, again, the important thing is to be clear about how the felicity conditions are being constrained, according to her, in such a way that these kinds of speech acts can't be performed. So that's the last bit. Does pornographic speech silence women's speeches? Arguably, yes, says Langton. And it does it by targeting the speech act of refusal and targeting the speech act of protest. So the thought here, to put it as heavy-handed as possible, is that saying no, trying to do a refusal, will now be blocked. One cannot even undergo that act. It'll fail to count as a refusal, even if that's the semantic content, even if that's the intended effect. Or similarly, one can protest about what is happening, but that mere protest is fed back into the machinery, and so it no longer counts as protest. It fails to meet the relevant felicity conditions as genuine protest, instead becoming part of the very pornographic actions. Again, now this isn't meant to be all-consuming, but at least given the setup, this seems pretty clear. So Langton concludes, pornography speech act sets felicity conditions for refusal and protest, and makes certain actions unspeakable for women in some contexts. Now notably, and I think this kind of comes back to the point here, right? All of this requires that pornography or pornographic makers, right, have a kind of authority over the relevant discourse. And if one undercuts the authority, then there's no way to do the silencing. That is, there's no way to prevent these kinds of illocutionary acts. Because they wouldn't have the right kind of authority to confer or revoke the powers to perform the actions. So we get these 2 points and these 2 sorts of arguments. Right? Pornography subordinates women, according to Langton, because speech can be action, and speech can subordinate. And pornography subordinates in virtue of unfairly ranking as inferior, legitimizing discrimination. Basically, again, this is the points we said earlier about thinking in terms of mere sexual objects. And finally, pornography arguably silences women because what it does is, by undertaking certain pornographic speech acts, it sets the felicity conditions in such a way that women cannot perform certain illocutionary acts. Okay. So that's a heavy topic. Slightly different than the stuff we've been doing. But I wanted to go through it for a couple reasons. I think one of them is it's a nice, very clear case where the stuff that we've been talking about with regards to philosophy of language has arguably some fairly heavy upshots. The other is, I think this is just a really nice use of this speech act theory. Whether we agree with Langton or not, I think it's very, very good in terms of making it clear why this stuff about pulling apart locutionary, perlocutionary, and illocutionary acts matters. Because, to take the recusal case, it's very clear that the illocutionary act is the thing that's being blocked. One isn't able to perform the refusal. That's why it's so worrisome. And note, this has nothing to do then with effects. Doesn't matter, to go back a few slides. Doesn't matter if we're trying to think about pornography as obscene or indecent or anything like that. Don't have to say anything along those lines. Just this idea that it prevents certain illocutionary acts, and in so doing deprives people of their civil rights. Which is a very, very clever argument. Again, whether we agree with it or not. So yeah, okay, cool. Before we wrap up, I want to quickly just pause and ask, what questions do we have? And that was, again, a little bit heavier than what we've usually done. Maybe I'll throw some questions out. Again, first, do we feel like we've got the grip on the difference between locutionary, perlocutionary, and illocutionary? I kind of understand. And then second is, second is, do we get how Langton's argument's structured? How it goes, and how it ties into the distinction that we just made? So third, I guess this is the big one, what do we think of Langton's argument?
Yeah, I think it's kind of fair. It seems to me like something I was used to some extent. I kind of like it. Especially if you take that definition forward, then I can make it.
I mean, I think I think maybe one of the most powerful things about it is it, at least, again, whether we think it succeeds or fails, it makes it clear that that initial definition isn't nonsense. There's a way to make sense of it that's perfectly good.
I I agree pretty much with everything she said. I think it for Canada can do or does those things in the majority of cases. But the only thing that I sort of intuitively find difficult is that she sort of tries to define foreign pornography like that in sort of an abstract way. Sort of this is porn. Well, it depends, I think, on sort of context and sort of yeah. And she almost like phrase it in sort of an a priori way, like porn is this. Well, I think it depends on certain other things in context.
On circumstance and things like this.
Yeah, even though I understand what she's doing.
Yeah, I think this kind of comes back to the very, very first thing we mentioned, right? There's a difference between what we might think of as sentences versus utterances. Or to put it in these terms, particular pictures and particular uses of pictures. The problem is, at least when we think about how pictures are made, they're always or almost always going to be made in particular usages. So the underlying thought here is, even if people don't necessarily intend to, they're going to be perpetuating this sort of structure. That's, I think, what Langton's going to lean into. But yeah. here's a weird thought experiment, and we'll maybe talk about this briefly and then we can head on. And this kind of comes back to what we were just mentioning. So one of the things that we might do to get around some of this is to have, say, completely computer-generated pornography. So the idea here would be that it doesn't involve exploiting anyone or using anyone, and it's maybe not even necessarily produced by anyone. We just let the AIs do their thing, the GANs and CANs produce a bunch of videos, and then we pick the ones that people find the most titillating. In those cases, it's not clear if it does this, because it's not clear if it's even a kind of utterance. But I'm not sure. I mean, what do people think?
I would say we could still perpetuate the same problems. There might not be people literally, like there might not be actual people involved, but it would still perpetuate sort of that perhaps power dynamic or how women are viewed, especially if you let the AI base it on already existing form, which would just sort of copy the same thing but without any people in it.
I think like you can still take like similar points where you just have to take everything around it. But I think like your conclusion will be kind of the same, but you just have to take some other steps.
I think what's interesting there, if we by that line, is that in some sense Langton isn't right then. Because it's not really the speech act. It's something about not even the utterance, because it doesn't even matter about the utterance. It's about its embedded circumstance.
Well, I think it can be both, right?
Yeah, but in the case of the AI, so this is why I was really leaning into this idea. It's not even an utterance. Because if it's not even an utterance, it can't be an elocutionary act.
No.
That's the weirdness.
But I think that if it's like not AI, then the speech act thing is just another point that like says it all, but like in a whole arena of argument.
Yeah.
You can use this one too, but I think if you just don't use AI, maybe this one isn't as strong anymore. There are still many ways to go to this.
Other thoughts on Langton before we pack up and trundle on? Okay. So I guess the last thing we'll say to set up for next time is, I didn't change the top thing. We're not going to do speech act theory again next time. What we're going to actually do next time is think about meaning, and meaning in a very general sense. So this kind of connects with some of the stuff we've talked about. So one of the lurking thoughts behind some of the stuff about felicity conditions, and certainly something that Langton leans into, is the idea that utterers' intentions matter. What the speaker meant to try and do, or wanted to try and do. And that's also important for uptake. Right? In order for your action to kind of go off, people need to grasp your utterance. People need to grasp your intention, what you wanted to try and do. So we might think that maybe intentions and intentionality can give us a kind of meaning. So that's what we're going to talk about next time. This is a broadly Gricean program, and it connects to this notion of pragmatics, which again builds from some of the stuff we've done, extends it in a neat way. So we have a very neat paper from Grice on meaning. It's not terribly long. I would very much suggest giving it a read. Yeah, that's what we'll talk about next time. Thank you guys for coming. Have a lovely week. And yeah, we'll see you all soon.